So this week's portion is called Vayigash, and the story opens up like this. Vayigash el of Yehuda, Judah approaches Joseph. Vayomer bi Adoni, says, "Please, my Lord, let me speak to you. Vayicha apcha bavdecha, do not become angry with me, ki kamocha kefaro, because you are like Pharaoh." And the story is basically that Joseph is sold into slavery, and Joseph finally becomes the vizier, the second in command in Egypt, and his brothers come down to Egypt, and they're accused of being spies. And Joseph is putting them through these many trials and tribulations, and at this point, it seems as if Yehuda had enough. Judah, he's the head of the tribes. He comes in front of Joseph, and he says, "Enough is enough. And, we came innocently just to get food, and you claim that we're spies. We need our brother back, and let's go back to our home." And at this point, Joseph says, the Torah tells us, Yosef wasn't able to contain himself any longer. And he says, let every man leave this room. And there was no man in the room when Yosef confessed to his brothers. So on a deeper level, we're trying to understand what exactly happened that we say at this point, Yosef finally decided that he's going to confess. He wasn't able any longer to contain himself. What changed in the narrative? What changed in the approach of the brothers? So on a deep level, we have to understand that the issue here is about an encounter, a true encounter. How does one human being encounter another human being? Up until this point in the narrative, Judah had one position and Joseph had another position. And they both didn't meet. Their eyes didn't meet. They each had what they wanted, and they were stuck in their own little small narrative. When Joseph puts the brothers through these trials and these tribulations and suspects them of being spies, he finally breaks down their ego, their small story, their small narrative. Judah at this point breaks, and he comes in front of Joseph and says, Vayigash elav Yehuda. Yehuda approaches Joseph and says, "Bi Adoni." Bi Adoni means literally, "In me is my Lord," which could mean, besides meaning, "Please, my Lord," it can mean that Judah is realizing that in me is you. Bi Adoni, in me is you, and in you is me. This is a true encounter with another. When a person can encounter another human being and see themselves within the other, that's the beginning of a healthy and a positive relationship. Because it's no longer an other that's outside myself. And therefore, you have your narrative, you have your story, your ego, and you connected with that and attached to that story, and I have my narrative. And therefore, there's no way for us to really deeply communicate. But when Yehuda is broken to the extent that he lets go of his ego, and he can see within Joseph himself, he can see a part of himself within Joseph, and Joseph within himself, then he can have a true encounter with Joseph. And this is what the Torah continues and says, V'loi yachol Yosef listapek. Joseph can no longer contain himself, because at this point there was a real encounter between Judah and Joseph. V'loi amad ish. There was no longer any man in the room when Joseph and Yehuda encountered each other with the tribes. So the Zohar says in this verse that, what does it mean that there was no longer a man? There are men. So Judah was there and Joseph was there. So what does it mean there was no longer a man that was standing in the room? What this deeply means is that they were no longer an ish. They transcended their ish, their ego, their story, their narrative. They, as human beings, connected to a particular ego, to a particular story, which didn't allow for them to encounter another that no longer existed. And when there was no longer an ish, there was no longer that ego, and there was that healthy relationship between finding another person, not just as an other, but finding something similar within yourself, similar to the other, then there can be a genuine encounter between these two brothers. And this is a very good, strong principle in terms of any type of relationship. So long as we look at another person, and all we see in the other person is just an other, with a capital O, we can never truly have an encounter with them. At best, we can have an I-it relationship. We can just use them and they can just use us. The moment we can see ourselves within them and we can see them within ourselves, we can have a genuine encounter between two human beings.